Okay, so this is going to be quite a long video. It might end up being 2 or 3 because we are on to the final section, which is about addiction, but covers around 10 pages. So let's see how we go. There are 2 PowerPoints on this. So the first one is the Intro to Psychological Problems. It's called Intro to Addiction and Theories of Addiction. And there is a case study in here. I got overexcited with Wiles's saying it was the last one. That was unlucky 13. This is lucky number 14. So we are looking at these ideas. I'm going through the PowerPoint as I am looking at this. So you've got some learning objectives and then thinking about the difference between addiction and dependence, substance misuse and substance abuse. Okay, there's a little video that you can take notes from. Then we need to look at pages 234 and 235. So this is addiction. Has your mother said you are addicted to your phone or maybe addicted to using the internet? Well, are you? It certainly is true that many people have their phone in their hand most of the time, or at least fairly close by. Many people feel slightly anxious when separated from their phone or if they can't find it. But then your mother might say the same about herself when you were a baby. She would certainly have panicked if she couldn't find you and she spent a lot of time with you. At what point might a mother's interest in her baby be regarded as an addiction, if ever? Right? And you will hear this all the time about mobile phones, don't you? That people can't live without them. And that seems to link to it being an addiction. I do that famous thing of I'm talking to somebody on the phone and I'm thinking, where's my phone? I need to make a note on this. Right? I don't make that many phone calls on my phone, I've got to be honest with you. And there is this difference, okay? When does it become an addiction? When we can't live without it, right? Mothers are really concerned about their children, and we know helicopter parents who don't allow their children any freedom. But is that an addiction? All right, so we need to look at what the definition is. So we're all familiar with a range of addictions. Addiction to alcohol, drugs, gambling, and so on. But when does liking chocolate a lot become a chocolate addiction? When does a smoker become an addicted smoker? Mark Griffiths has spent a lifetime studying addiction. He would distinguish, for example, a keen gardener from an addict in terms of salience. The activity has become the most important thing in that person's life. It takes over interest in all other activities, such as work and family relationships. Griffiths would also include dependence and substance abuse as prime defining characteristics. All right, so it might be that I love gardening, if I had a garden. But yeah, I do enjoy doing gardening when I have the opportunity. Right? That doesn't mean that I'm addicted to it, and that's the point. It could still be the most important thing in my life, but if I had to change that for something else, I may be perfectly okay. It's when that losing it becomes the difficulty. So dependence on a substance or behaviour does not necessarily mean addiction. Dependence is one of the characteristics of addiction, but in itself is not sufficient for the substance behaviour to be classed as addiction. So I would say that I'm not human until I have a cup of tea in the morning. But actually, if I don't have a cup of tea in the morning, I'm just as horrible as I am normally. So it's not an addiction, right? I can still go all the way through the day without having a cup of tea if necessary. So for example, a person may become dependent on pain medication. The pain they experience makes it impossible to lead a normal life without the medication. There is a psychological reliance on the substance or the activity. This dependence crosses the line into an addiction when the person starts taking the pain medication because it gives them a buzz or a sense of escape. Dependence is also signalled by withdrawal symptoms. When the substance or activity is stopped, the person may experience physical problems such as headaches or difficulty sleeping, or psychological problems such as moodiness. Right? I mean, I'm a bit like that if I don't get enough chocolate, right? But, you know, this is the idea. So the key difference between substance misuse and substance abuse is the person's intention when using a substance, such as sleeping pills. Both misuse and abuse are potentially harmful. In the case of misuse, a person is not following the rules for usage. For example, a person is taking a drug more often than prescribed, such as taking too many sleeping pills in the hope that this will deal with sleeplessness. Or a person may stop taking a medication too soon. We often do this, don't we? I'm better, I don't need to carry on. Misuse also includes using a drug for something other than what it was intended for. For example, taking antidepressants to help lose weight. However, in all these examples, the person has not used the substance in order to experience euphoria or to get high, nor to create a sense of escape or numbness. This is when misuse becomes abuse. The person's intentions are focused on that outcome, and that outcome is some kind of mood modification. This is sometimes described as self-medication. The person is using the substance or behaviour to help them cope with their life problems. Okay, so let's have a look at the study tip at the bottom. This is characteristics of addiction versus ICD. So on this page, we've looked at some of the characteristics of addiction, such as dependence and substance misuse. However, it is important to distinguish these from the ICD list of clinical characteristics. This ICD list is what is actually used to make a diagnosis of addiction. This distinction is important for you because the ICD characteristics are identified in the specification. Therefore, any question on characteristics is referring to ICD rather than a general discussion of dependence and/or abuse. If you find some of the ICD characteristics confusing, enhance your understanding by trying to apply them to everyday examples of possible addiction. Okay, so let's have a look at this ICD-10 again that we've kind of touched on before and see whether we can make more sense of it. So earlier in this chapter, on page 223, we looked at how clinical depression is diagnosed. A diagnosis of any physical or mental health problem is done using a list of clinical characteristics. So the clinical characteristics of addiction are a list of the symptoms we are looking for to diagnose addiction. The list is published in a classification system such as the International Classification of Disease, the ICD. The list of clinical characteristics for addiction comes from the International Classification of Disease version 10. ICD-10 has a category called mental and behavioural disorders due to psychoactive substance abuse disorders. Psychoactive refers to a drug that has a psychological effect, altering perception, mood or consciousness. A definite diagnosis of addiction is usually made only if 3 or more of the following have been present together at some time during the previous year. So, number 1 is a strong desire to use the substance. The individual experiences a sense of compulsion to use the substance. You feel you can't live without it. 2, persisting despite harm. The individual continues to take the substance despite clear evidence of negative consequences, such as damage to their liver through excessive drinking. It should be clear that the individual is aware of their nature and extent of the potential harm. All right, so I was listening to a podcast the other day where Bob Mortimer was talking on Desert Island Discs, and he was saying he'd had heart surgery because he'd had a major heart problem. And he said afterwards he went with his wife and they went to a cafe and he ate his last ever bacon butty. Right, so he had this thing which he loved to say goodbye to it, and then he stopped eating it and has stopped eating them because he knew that eating bacon was harmful for him and for his heart after the heart operation. Right, so he is not persisting, even though he loves a bacon butty, he can give it up. Right, so he is not addicted. It is when somebody knows something is going to do them harm, but they still take it in any case. Like an alcoholic who is told, if you have another drink, it could kill you. and yet they still have one. Number 3 is difficulty in controlling use. The individual may have problems stopping usage and or limiting the levels of use. Okay, so yeah, again, this could be that you're taking too much, you're not using medication in the right way, those sorts of things. A higher priority given to the substance. The individual finds that their substance use matters more to them than other activities or responsibilities. Other pleasures or interests are neglected because of the psychoactive substance use and the time needed to service this. All right, so, I mean, you'll find this particularly when people are addicted to alcohol, that, you know, they neglect going home to their family, they neglect doing, doing their job properly, right? 1, because they're drunk, or 2, because they need more time to be able to get on and drink, yeah? Okay, number 5 is a withdrawal state. The individual feels worse than normal when they stop using the substance or they cut down how much they take. Withdrawal symptoms vary from substance to substance, but may include vomiting, irritability, tiredness, headache and anxiety. Now, when people cut sugar out of their diet, they can get some of those symptoms as well, right? But it is when that persists and the person their body is struggling with coping without that substance. And then number 6 is evidence of tolerance. The individual requires increased doses of the psychoactive substance in order to achieve effects originally produced by lower doses. Okay, and this is often how people end up moving on to addictive drugs, or highly addictive drugs and dangerous drugs, because the drug that they were taking initially, they feel they can control, and they can, but then it stops giving them the buzz that it used to give them, and so therefore they need something more. Whether that means they take more of that drug or they move on to something more hardcore, you have those differences. Alright, there is a stretch and challenge on page 235. ICD is produced by the World Health Organization, a specialised agency of the United Nations with responsibility for international health matters. ICD includes both physical and psychological disorders. The American Psychiatric Association produces an alternative classification system called the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, currently in its 5th revision. A classification system is a way of seeing the world at a point in time. That's why it needs constant revision. Our understanding of both physical and psychological problems changes. There are many differences between ICD and DSM. For example, DSM includes gambling with addiction, whereas ICD places pathological gambling separately. This underlines the fact that mental health problems are not real things. People decide where to draw the lines and what is a problem and what isn't. All right, so if you're asked to decide that, if you're given a question, that is a scenario type of question, the decision you make is not going to be incorrect. Remember, try to use the ICD classifications and use facts to come to your conclusion. Okay, going back to our PowerPoint, there is a PowerPoint to do comparisons. So if you want to look at what we've read on pages 234 and 235 and just make some notes so you have a difference between addiction, dependence, substance misuse and substance abuse. Okay. So then there are the clinical characteristics for ICD-10, just so you've got those. And then, do you think that nature or nurture are most influential in whether or not people develop an addiction? Why and why not? All right, so there's a question for you to consider. It would be something that we could discuss. We can do so if we can get onto Google Meet and all chat to each other on there. Right, then it's talking about creating a poster. I'm not that worried about posters at this point in time. There is an extension activity about researching the effects that illegal drug use has on the areas of the brain you have learnt about. Findings could then be shared with the rest of the class. Yep, by all means, have a look at that. And then I've also put on there to research forms of substance abuse and rates in the UK. Okay, so remember the study tip said you will be using ICD-10. when you are talking about how you classify addiction. Therefore, it's useful for you to know some percentages about drug addiction that are to do with the UK. All right, I'm going to stop recording here and I'll start recording again. But at the moment, we are at slide 7. Right, so somehow I didn't write onto the PowerPoint for you to complete apply it concept and check it from page 235. I will put new PowerPoints up that have this on there, and I'll take pictures with that on there as well, so that you get all of this attached with the video for this. Alright, so we're on slide 7. There is a little starter about the Global Drug Survey, and then it asks you to go on and read pages 236 and 237 as a class. And we are really actually going on to our final case study here. So there are 2 kinds of twins, identical and non-identical. Identical twins have exactly the same genes because they come from one egg cell called monozygotic, or MZ. Mono means one and zygote is a fertilized egg cell. My favorite word in a dictionary. Non-identical twins are as similar as any brother or sister. They share about 50% of the same genes. They come from 2 fertilized egg cells called dizygotic, or DZ, di for 2, right? If a particular trait like eye colour is determined by your genes, nature, then we would expect all MZ twins to have the same eye colour because they have the same genes. We would only expect about half of DZ twins to have the same eye colour. If, on the other hand, eye colour is determined by nurture, then we would expect there to be no difference in how similar MZ and DZ twins are because their environment when growing up was the same. Twin studies are a kind of natural experiment. Alright, so we have twins in our class. Shall we experiment on them? No, maybe not. I feel I'm mean enough to them as it is. So let's think about this idea then, okay? Why is it that psychologists would want to look at twins, right? Because here is an obvious opportunity to see biological differences that there are with people as opposed to environmental differences. So that whole nature versus nurture argument that's going on. So let's have a look at this. The influence of nature or genes, hereditary factors. Research suggests that addictions are moderately to highly inherited. In other words, the genetic information that is passed from your parents to you when you were conceived, hereditary factors, may determine whether you are likely to become addicted or not. Right, now I think that my ex-husband has an addictive personality. It's what I see in him. But I also see that in my son. So it's things like he can't understand why I can have chocolate in the fridge but not eat it. Okay, he would come in and just eat it all if he was upset about something. Right, genetic vulnerability. In fact, it isn't as simple as that. Very few genes have an all or nothing effect on behaviour. One gene does not make the difference to whether, for example, you become addicted to alcohol or not. Multiple genes are involved, and moreover, what genes do is create a vulnerability. If you do inherit certain addiction genes, they each increase the risk that you might become addicted. The diathesis stress explanation, which is on page 225, proposes that a genetic vulnerability, nature, is only expressed if a person's life stresses and experiences, nurture, act as a trigger. So as we've said many times before, it is virtually impossible to separate nature and nurture. They are working together to understand the person. And like we said as well, when you are looking at addictions or depression, you can't just say it's due to that one thing. You've got to look at the whole picture to understand it. Alright, so here comes our named study, our final one. This is Cage's twin study of alcohol abuse. So twin studies are often used to understand the relative contributions of nature and nurture to behaviour, genes and environment. The introduction on the left explains why twin studies are used. Leonard Cage conducted the first systematic study to look at alcoholism in twins. All right, and on our PowerPoint we have a reduced version of this. But at the bottom, I've asked you to write a 100-word summary and then add it to your revision case study. So no more than 10 words, as many pictures, numbers and symbols as you like. But let's just go through it. So the Cage's aim was to see whether alcoholism could be explained in terms of hereditary factors. Do children inherit a genetic vulnerability to become alcoholic? The method was, the study looked at male twins from Skane in Sweden. The twins were identified using Temperance Board registration data. Temperance boards were established in Sweden to register and follow individuals who had problems with alcohol abuse. 310 male twins were identified, where at least one twin was registered with the Swedish Temperance Board. Cage conducted interviews with those twins registered by the Temperance Board and, in some cases, interviews with close relatives to collect information about drinking habits and also whether the twins were identical or non-identical. Cage classified 48 as identical and 126 as non-identical, giving a total of 384 twin participants. The numbers don't match because in some twin pairs, both were registered by the Temperance Board, whereas in other twin pairs, only one was registered. The results were the percentage of twins who had a co-twin registered with the Temperance Board was significantly higher for identical twins than non-identical twins. 61% of the identical twins were both alcoholic, whereas only 39% of the non-identical twins were. Cage also noted that those twins with social problems were likely to be overrepresented among Temperance Board registrants. I probably could have worked that out. Conclusions. The data suggests that alcoholism is related to hereditary factors. However, if alcoholism was entirely due to hereditary, we would expect 100% of the alcoholic identical twins to have a co-twin who is also alcoholic. If alcoholism has no genetic component, we would expect the data for identical and non-identical twins to be the same. Therefore, the data from this study supports the idea of a vulnerability because the genetic component wasn't 100%, nor was it 0%. The increased social problems among alcoholic twins suggest that there are environmental factors that contribute to alcoholism. Okay, so there is a genetic component, but it is a vulnerability rather than a definite thing that is going to happen. Right, let's look at the evaluation of this. Okay, as a negative, one weakness of Cage's twin study is that there were flaws in the design of his study. One major problem is that he was not actually studying alcoholism. Temperance Board data only includes some kinds of alcohol problems, those drinkers who made a public display of their abuse. People were only registered with the Temperance Board if they were arrested for public drunkenness, driving under influence of alcohol and/or committing a crime in connection with alcohol. A further issue is that the data on MZ versus DZ twins was collected by self-report from one of the twins or another informant, such as a family member. This means the classifications may not have been accurate, and overall the result lacks validity. Okay, remember, what's the difference between validity and reliability? Yeah, and you know, because somebody is on this list because they have been drink driving does not necessarily mean that they have an alcohol problem. It might have been a one-off example. All right, however, as a positive, there is a strength in that Cage's results have been supported by later research. Kenneth Kendler et al. Conducted a better controlled study using a larger sample, 2,516 individual twins from the Swedish Temperance Register. They again found that if one co-twin was alcoholic, their twin was more likely to also be alcoholic if they were MZ twins than if they were DZ twins, 48% compared to 33%. Research generally supports the view that genetic factors have a major influence on alcoholism for both males and females. Yeah, so genetics plays a large part, but then environment and nurture obviously also is in there. As an extra negative point, misunderstanding genetic vulnerability. One weakness with biological explanations of addiction is that they may be misleading. Some people assume that a biological explanation means that you inherit certain genes, then addiction is inevitable. It is very important to understand the concept of vulnerability. Genes increase the risk of addiction, but are not the only factor. The evidence clearly shows that both nature and nurture are important. Therefore, an issue with these explanations is that they imply that genes are more influential than they actually are. All right, so we have to temper this, because we're looking at the temperance board, with thinking actually how much of a role does genetics play. It has some parts to play, but let's not emphasize it. All right, so there's a little picture at the top that says, "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours." The temperance movement aimed to reduce and ban alcohol consumption, especially spirits. It began in the 19th century and spread to many countries around the world. The Salvation Army, a temperance movement, still exists today with over 1.5 million members. Okay, the stretch and challenge. Some people blame addiction on the person. They believe that an individual ought to be able to control their behaviour better, and they are weak to give in to impulses. Genetic research shows that this is not entirely their fault. It shows that some people are born with a predisposition to behave in this way, which means it makes it harder for them to resist alcoholism or other addictions. Okay. In the case of my ex-husband, that would be smoking as the big one. So this is a positive outcome from genetic research. However, there is a negative aspect to genetic research called the eugenic movement. Supporters of eugenics believe that the human race could be improved by selective breeding. We could prevent some people reproducing in order to weed out undesirable traits. Aside from ethical issues related to this argument, the other main issue with the eugenic idea is that genes alone don't explain behaviours such as addiction. And, you know, gosh, how do you then sort of decide that you tell somebody they can't have a baby or, you know, whatever else? Genetic engineering is another way of using genetic evidence. This view suggests that we can edit a person's genes to avoid problem characteristics. Again, in the case of addiction, this presumes that genes are the only factor. Yes, so we're going to combine everything. Oh my God, I didn't choose the music behind me. How appropriate is this? Study tip, more evaluating. If you're asked to evaluate the biological explanation, remember that you can always use the evaluation of the study. If you do this, then just remember to make the point that if the study has limitations, then this makes it less effective support for the explanation. Yeah, you can do your own evaluations, but we know we can use the ones from in the book. Right, if we go back to the PowerPoint, so you should have written a summary of this study and added it to your case study sheet. Slide 9 just has another version of it from the other book, which I quite liked, this version of it. So just have a little read of that to see whether that makes it clearer to you. Then slide 10 is looking at weaknesses and strengths, and asking you just to try and write this using the NEA, name the point, explain the point, and apply the point method. If that scaffold works for you, then use that. And then there's a question, what support is there for the biological explanations? If you feel you are happy and you have explained all of this in your own summary of it, then that's fine. You don't need to do all of this. Yes, then there are some questions thinking about sampling methods, the participants method that was used, whatever else. Okay, so it's really just looking at some of the ideas that could have changed this study so that you can consider it in a more viable way. All right, I've ended up there. It's asking you to design a questionnaire. It would be lovely if we had time to do that, but I don't think we have. Then complete the check-it and apply it concept on page 237, complete a revision task. All right, and then we are on to pages 238 and 239, which I will just make a separate recording for that. So we're moving on to pages 238 and 239. This is slide 11 on the Intro to Addiction and Theories of Addiction PowerPoint. This is Theories of Addiction, Psychological Explanations. So you may think you know what your peers are doing, but they may not be telling you the truth. People sometimes boast about what they do. For example, how much they drink or smoke. Perhaps they feel it is impressive to drink or smoke more. The problem is that all of us are influenced by what everyone else is doing, even though our perception of what everyone else is doing may be wrong. Social norms marketing advertising aims to change students' perceptions of their peers' drinking habits through the use of mass media and other communication techniques. One example of this is the beer mat shown to the right. Alright, I'm just reading it. So have a look, read what it says. The adverts focus on providing information such as actual statistics about how much students typically drink. The hope is that by giving students more accurate information, this will help combat the overestimation of what everyone is doing. You know, and when somebody says, oh, well, I blacked out and I can't remember what I did and da-da-da-da-da, you know, it's like, well, that's not actually the most sensible thing to be doing with yourself. And also, there should be a point where you are drinking responsibly if you choose to drink, right? And you should know that's enough now. I don't need to drink anymore, right? So if you look to the top right on page 239, it talks about peer pressure. It says one of the reasons why we all conform to social norms is that we want to be liked. One way to get in with a group of people is to behave like them. Adolescence is a time when people are particularly sensitive to being liked or disliked. All right, so, you know, here's the thing, is that this result of peer pressure may be that people do things that they don't necessarily want to do. So nature goes out of the window here and nurture comes in completely. So let's have a look at the idea, the influence of nurture or peer influence. Nurture refers to those aspects of behaviour that are acquired through experience, i.e. learned from interactions with the physical and or social environment. One of the most important factors in determining young people's behaviour is peer influence. Your peers are people who are your equal in terms of, for example, age or education. So social learning theory. Albert Bandura proposed a very influential theory in psychology called social learning theory. This theory explains how other people, that is, our social world, influence us. Bandura suggested that we learn what to do and what to think by observing what other people are doing and saying. Obviously, we know from looking at various things that that's how children learn in the first place. Now, if that's how you've learnt when you're younger, then of course you're going to apply that as you get older as well. We then imitate these behaviours, especially if it seems that others are rewarded for the behaviour or beliefs. For example, if someone else gets respect or gets some other benefits, then it would seem like a good idea to copy their behaviour. We may do this unconsciously, like me when I start imitating somebody's accent when they're talking to me. The final ingredient of social learning theory is that we are most likely to imitate someone we admire and identify with, such as associating with or looking up to a celebrity or a teacher we like, or one of our peers. Identification with peers is especially strong in adolescence. So of course, because this is when you're finding yourself and you're finding the things that you want to be doing. But there are many adults who still have this influence over them. Alright, social norms. We learn from our peers' behaviours and attitudes. This is where social norms come in, i.e. the rules about behaviour that you learn from other people around you. In many situations, it is not clear how to behave, and we look to the behaviour of others, their norms, to tell us what to do or think. They are social norms because they come from other people. Social refers to other people. In terms of addiction and peer influences, these social norms tell you what is acceptable for your social group. Of course, individuals may overestimate how much their social group is, for example, drinking. This means that the key factor is perceived social norms, right? So your friends may tell you they are drinking this much or smoking that much or whatever else, right? But it's what you perceive, right? Because that may not be accurate. Social identity theory. Adolescents may feel pressure to conform to the social norms of their peer group. Social identity theory can explain this. A significant part of who you are is defined by the social groups you belong to, your friends, the football team you support, TV programs you like, and so on. Each of us belongs to many social groups. In order to maintain your group membership and be accepted by your peers in that group, you are drawn to behave and think like them. This explains the pressure to conform to social norms, right? So take something like Game of Thrones, which I've never watched an episode of. You hear lots and lots of people talking about it, okay? Suddenly you start thinking, should I watch this? Then I can join in the conversations, right? Think about if you're talking about a band that you particularly like. You know, one of your friends may say, I'll take that as my example. Oh, I really love Gary Barlow, right? Maybe they do, okay? And many people do, right? But me, I love Howard Donald. And many people say to me, why on earth do you like him? He's the skanky one in the group or whatever else, right? But that is my personal choice. And I could go, oh, well, Gary's quite sweet. Maybe I do like him as well, right? But I have a strong enough social identity that I am happy to stand up and say, no, it's Howard that I love, right? But that's difficult to do when you're younger and you're setting yourself against other people. So creating opportunities for addictive behaviour. Peers also influence addictive behaviour because they provide opportunities for an individual to smoke or use alcohol. Someone else may be able to buy alcohol for group members or provide a place to take drugs in safety. Peers may also provide direct instruction about what to do. Yeah, so you see this, don't you, when they say, oh, take a puff of the cigarette. No, don't suck it in, you know, blow rings and whatever else, right? So you get all of this type of idea. Okay. Let's just look at the stretch and challenge before we go on to look at the evaluation. Another psychological explanation for addiction comes from operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is about rewards. The reasons we repeat a behaviour is because it was rewarding. The specialist term for the effects of rewards is reinforcement. This explanation suggests that we repeat a behaviour that has pleasurable consequences. If you remember, the definition we gave for substance abuse on page 234 was that a key feature is the euphoric experience or high. This reinforces the behaviour which created the high and makes it more likely that the behaviour will be repeated until, of course, you get to the point where it's not having an effect anymore. Interestingly, this psychological explanation is tied to a biological one because psychologists now know that there is a part of the brain that responds when an animal receives a reward. This part of the brain is called the reward centre. So the psychological explanation has a biological basis. On its own, the biological explanation might be viewed as reductionist, but both explanations taken together can be viewed as a more holistic approach. And remember, we talked about intrinsic and extrinsic rewards, right? Where we say, no, don't give me money to learn how to play the guitar or pass my exams because I want to do it because I want to do it, right? I want to feel good for myself, not because you're going to give me money for it, although some of us might like the money as well, yeah? All right, let's look at the evaluation. Okay, so positively, one strength of peer influence as an explanation of addiction is that there is research support. Bruce Simons Morton and Tildes Farhat reviewed 40 studies into the relationship between peers and smoking and found that all but one showed a positive association between the two factors. Of course, an association does not mean that the peer influence caused the addiction behaviour, but at the very least it suggests that peer influences are a risk factor. All right, so going back to that idea before about vulnerability with genetics, here is a risk factor, yeah, through peer influence. So negatively, it may be peer selection. So one weakness of the peer influence explanation is that the process may not work in that direction. It may be that what is actually happening is that individuals select friendship groups where members are behaving like they are. Therefore, people who have an addiction actively select others who are like them rather than conforming to the social norm of the group. This means that addictive behaviours shared within a friendship group happen as a consequence of addiction, rather than the group causing the addiction through social norms and group pressure. Yeah, so somebody may join a group because they're doing the things that you want to do, rather than you then join that group and think, oh, I might start trying that. Okay, finally, as a positive point, one strength of the peer influence explanation is a number of real-world applications. So social norms marketing advertising has been used to address the issue of perceived norms. Results of research into the success of such methods have been mixed, but it remains a popular approach in the USA in particular. William Hanson and John Graham compared two programs for reducing substance abuse. One program was just about resistance skills and the other focused on normative education, learning about acceptability in peers. The latter program had greater success. Such applications demonstrate the positive value of peer influence explanations. And let's not forget, peer influence can be positive as well as negative. It may be that because nobody in your group smokes or drinks or takes drugs, neither do you, right? So there are the positive side to it as well. And then finally, as a study tip, maintain focus. It's easy when discussing peer influences to start being quite general. It is important to maintain your focus on peer influences as an explanation for addiction. Yep, so be specific. Don't be too vague and general about things. All right, if you look back to the PowerPoint, we're on slide 11. I've asked you to create a table or a mind map showing the biological explanations and psychological explanations for addiction, and then to carry out the questionnaires about peer influence and substance use, if you can. Obviously, that's going to be quite difficult. We could use SurveyMonkey, I suppose. Then complete, check it and apply it research on page 239 and have a go at a revision task. Yeah, I mean, I would suggest you look back at the things to do with intrinsic and extrinsic motivation through the learning skills that we looked at previously. All right, so then slide 12, it just gives you some places that you can actually look at from the UK where they do really help people who have questions, issues, things that they just need to talk about. That's just there for you, just in case anybody needs it on the PowerPoint.